Hi, this is Anna Sharp. I'm going to be talking about chapters 35 through 38 of Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I noticed in this section of the book she talked a lot about race and privilege, or that came up with the characters many times, so I'm going to focus on that. First, wanted to talk about Americentrism and Eurocentrism, which is a belief that Western values and culture are the standard to hold every other culture and their values against. So I noticed this come up with Ifemelu and Blaine. With their disagreements, it seemed to me that Blaine would brush aside what Ifemelu said about her own experience in her native country, acting like his view was the one that mattered. Ifemelu also points out a couple of times in the novel cultural appropriation on the part of Americans. In this section, she is thinking of imagining African sculptures in the corners of these people's homes, Americans' homes. And earlier in the novel, when she's with Kurt's friends, and they have plates and things from India, she's thinking about how these items are so beautiful to these Americans because they are made by poor brown children. So she's noticing Americans taking kind of like these tokens from other cultures and showing them in their American homes. Another aspect of Americentrism and Eurocentrism is to see racism as a personal flaw and not address the fact that it's a systematic issue. So it's kind of taking the blame away from European and American values and saying, well, if somebody is racist, it's just their own problem. This quote I have at the bottom is from Shan talking about her friend who's a Nigerian author. He's always fretting about how his books don't do well. I've told him he needs to write terrible things about his own people if he wants to do well. He needs to say Africans alone are to blame for African problems, and Europeans have helped Africa more than they've hurt Africa, and he'll be famous, and people will say he's so honest. So this quote is kind of exemplifying the fact that Western culture and values seem to be more valued in society, that people don't want to hear it from other points of view, like this African man's point of view as an author. So getting more into racism, Adichie addresses white fragility in this section of the book. So from Robin DiAngelo's article in 2011, white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. So white fragility is the phenomena of white people being too uncomfortable to have difficult conversations about race and systematic racism and feeling personally offended by suggestions that white people are the oppressors. And I really liked Ifemelu's blog post about Obama, and I thought this quote in particular really addresses white fragility. She's talking about Black Americans. So they know a harsher, uglier America. But you're not supposed to say that, because in America, everything is fine and everyone is the same. And what's a magic Negro, you ask? The Black man who is eternally wise and kind. He never reacts under great suffering, never gets angry, is never threatening. He always forgives all kinds of racist shit. He teaches the white person how to break down the sad but understandable prejudice in his heart. So what she's talking about, this the characterization of the magic Negro who's there to educate a white racist man. We see this a lot in American films. Um, I feel like where the black character is ends up being used as a tool for the white character to further their growth, um, which shows how what a gentle approach white people need to see taken to approaching race instead of having frank, uncomfortable conversations about systematic oppression. Colorblind racism also comes up in this section of the book. So, color blindness is a way for people to avoid difficult conversations about race. And it's not that they don't see color, it's that they don't want to admit having an advantage over anyone else. It's the oppressors not wanting to admit that they're the beneficiaries of oppressive systems. The quote that I pulled up from the book in this section is in a list that Ifemelu puts in one of her blog posts. It's a list of questions by Peggy McIntosh. The list of questions, if you answer no to most of them, then you have white privilege. But the one that I chose, I think it speaks specifically to colorblindness. When you use the word nude color of underwear and band-aids, do you already know that it will not match your skin? Thinking about nude shades, band-aids, tights, underwear, what have you. As a white person growing up, like that was just normal and I didn't question it. And this is still a big problem now. Some companies are becoming more aware and providing more options, but we do often see nude colors to be assumed as Caucasian. So I just want to put out some questions to think about. In what ways can you address colorblind racism in the workplace or with clients? This is something that you might think that you don't have to worry about in the field of social work, but it will come up. At my internship this year, I had a task supervisor who told me he didn't believe in white privilege. He thought there was no more white privilege, there was only green privilege, meaning class privilege. So that was a conversation I wasn't expecting to have at my social work internship, but it happened. So how are we going to prepare ourselves to have these conversations with colleagues? And thinking about the fact that the point of colorblind racism, or the point against colorblind racism, is that not everyone is the same. We can't say that we're colorblind because we do see people's skin color, and we know in America that changes their experience living here. So therefore, we know not everyone is the same. But at the same time, as social workers, we want to provide fair treatment for our clients. So is it difficult to differentiate between not treating everyone the same despite their differences and treating all of those you encounter with fairness and compassion? I have a video about white fragility I'd like to share.
How do you feel when you see a headline like this? Or this? If you're white, you might feel uncomfortable, guilty, or even angry. In this video, we're going to talk about why that happens and how to overcome it. Most white Americans don't realize our culture protects us from having to truly confront racial inequality, which gives us a major blind spot when it comes to understanding what the reality of systemic racism is for people of color, or how complicit we may be in their oppression. We think of racism as something bad people engage in, instead of something we're conditioned into from childhood. As a result, when indirect, unconscious, or less obvious forms of racism and discrimination are exposed for what they are, it challenges our beliefs about ourselves and our world, provoking our own blind spots when it comes to race. And more often than not, well, let's just say we don't handle it well. The phrase was invented by Robin DiAngelo, a multicultural education expert, to talk about what happens consciously and unconsciously when white Americans are confronted with challenges to white dominance. According to DiAngelo, even a minimal amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, including the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors wind up preserving the status quo, protecting white comfort, and therefore reinstating white dominance. White fragility is triggered by interruptions, in which white codes of discourse are broken to force a white person to confront racism, and they show up in a number of different ways. Like when anyone, white or otherwise, suggests that a white person's viewpoint is racist. When people of color talk candidly about their experiences of racism. When people of color choose not to share stories or answer questions about their racial experience. And especially whenever people of color choose not to protect the racial feelings of white people. Some other instances of racial stress include when white people are denied access to black safe spaces or black bodies. When white people are told their actions have racist impacts. When racial inclusivity gets prioritized over group membership. When double standards are exposed. When white meritocracy is challenged by exposing white privilege. Whenever white centrality is challenged by narratives in which people of color are front and center without being presented stereotypically. And finally, when a person of color holds a position of leadership. Whatever the cause, knee-jerk overreactions protect white dominance by silencing non-white voices and segregating whites from people of color. By distancing ourselves from racially stressful situations and refusing to consider other perspectives, white people take advantage of the very race privilege we claim not to have. As long as white people require conversations about race to be comfortable for us, racial equality will be a lot harder to achieve. So what do we do when our rules stand in the way of dealing constructively with racism? The answer is, we break the rules. The best way to defeat white fragility is to grow a thicker skin. Build your racial stamina by following some do's and don'ts. Don't assume you are objective or an authority on the experiences of people of color. In a racialized society, whites inevitably have a blind spot. Resist the urge to get defensive when people of color speak honestly about their experiences. Catch yourself whenever you find yourself thinking that a black person's perspective is divisive or abusive. That's often a sign that you lack understanding. Don't recenter a conversation or narrative involving race around you or your feelings. Instead, cede the floor to your neighbors of color to amplify and learn from their perspectives. Explore the complexity of individuals you disagree with or don't understand. Your realities are totally different, and you will never breach that divide by running away from or silencing uncomfortable exchanges. Before getting angry, think about the root cause or need behind someone's emotional outburst or complaint. What you're interpreting as impoliteness or vitriol may be the best available means for them to express their experience of racism. Remember, in this society, white people are safer, included, and seen by default. The same is not true for people of color, which is why forcing them to shoulder the burden of fighting for equality, requiring them to be friendly and helpful in the face of white ignorance, and expecting them to give white people the benefit of the doubt, is not only wrong but also makes well-meaning white people complicit in their oppression. Choosing not to be sensitive in a world that already shelters you will improve your racial resiliency, lead to better relationships with your black and brown friends and neighbors, and most importantly, create necessary space for the equality and justice that people of color deserve.
I really like that video, and especially the advice they give to white people, especially grow a thicker skin, because that tends to be the message that people of color get in the face of racism. And it's something that white people should be doing more of. Um, so that video leads perfectly into white privilege. In the US, white privilege is everywhere because it is built into our systems. This quote from Shine 2011: higher education, as a major system in US society, is inevitably racially structured. What is taught and not taught in colleges and universities across the country are the results of structural racism and white privilege. So the author is speaking about the education system, which is just one of many that are, well, all that are influenced by white privilege. And she's speaking about higher education, but we can even think about grade school and high school, where the history taught is centered on the experiences of white folks, and black and brown people don't see representation when they're learning in school. This quote I have below is from one of Ifamelu's blog posts again, and it's a white student speaking in class. Why must we always talk about race anyway? Can't we just be human beings? And Professor Hunk replied, that is exactly what white privilege is, that you can say that. Race doesn't exist for you because it has never been a barrier. Black folks don't have that choice. So this quote demonstrates or illustrates what white privilege is, and it also harkens back to color blindness. This student is thinking, like, what's the big deal about race? Why do we have to talk about it? I don't think about it. And that's precisely because he doesn't have to, because he's white. And I'd like to make the point that privilege is the other side of oppression. So if we can acknowledge that groups of people are oppressed, then we must be able to acknowledge that those that are not have privilege. Something that you might hear from white people sometimes, I've had a hard life, what makes me have privilege? I haven't had it easy. The answer to that is a question, which is, have your challenges come from the color of your skin? And the answer would be no. And I have one more short video, and I will put the links to both of these in the description.
White privilege. You may not be aware if you have it, but you sure as hell know if you don't. White privilege refers to the benefits white people get from society that people of color don't. It's walking into a store and not being followed on the suspicion you might steal. It's wearing baggy pants and a backwards hat and not being labeled a gangsta. And it's not being harassed by the cops. But what does it mean to you? What is white privilege?
In my opinion, I would say that white privilege is a luxury that white people have of not being judged off top.
It's probably subtle, but with what's happening lately, it's really hard to miss or to think that it doesn't exist. Nobody cares about this kind of stuff.
Yes, they do. I think they do, especially now in terms,
It is what it is,
Does white privilege exist?
Absolutely.
What is it?
It's the ability to have our kids playing in a park and play with a toy gun and not get shot.
Do you think white privilege exists?
Definitely. It's basically a ticket to anything that everybody else is excluded from because of your skin color.
Do you think you benefit from that?
Absolutely.
How so?
I can expect to be treated respectfully, and I can expect to be taken for who I am without people thinking about my skin color often. It's fucked up.
Here's how great it is to be white. I could get in a time machine and go to any time, and it would be awesome when I get there. That is exclusively a white privilege.
You know, I got called the N-word the other day. You know, I couldn't really do anything due to the fact that, you know, if I did anything, I may get shot by the police. So, you know, that's white privilege. You know, some people can do certain things that, you know, African Americans really can't do.
What are some other examples of white privilege that you think you see in your day-to-day life where white people might get certain benefits from society that, you know, you don't?
Banks. If you have bad credit or you have okay credit like I do, why can't you give me a chance to build my credit? They give it to the white man or the white woman real quick. Why you don't think that I want that?
There's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot that we have that we take for granted, and a lot of it has to do with race.
We're just going to intellectually denigrate and scold you for the abuse of your white privilege. What's white privilege?
If you grew up white, how do you think your life might have been different?
Damn. Excuse me. That's a good question.
I'll probably have a better job than I have now. You know, I'll probably have a better education, probably have better opportunities to get out the neighborhood and have a chance, you know, and not be like stereotyped based on what my parents went through.
What would you do differently if you were a white guy for
What
a
would
day?
I do differently? I don't know, get money, get paid? I don't know.
It would be nice to just walk around and not feel judged all the time. If my boyfriend and I could both walk around and be white for a day together, like that would be amazing, and to not be called, you know, a nigger lover or something like that.
If I was a white dude for a day, I wouldn't really run into any issues during the daytime at all. Like, I just kind of walk around and exist. You should probably put like a GoPro camera on an African American male, have him walk around. You'd have to be in my shoes though to feel it.
If I have recognition that like police brutality will be fixed immediately and how everything.
I like that video. I think it illustrates really well why white people are unaware of their privilege or can be, because they go through their daily life thinking that's just normal life. They don't think about the fact that they have an upper hand in a lot of situations, like the gentleman mentioned with a bank loan, or just not being afraid when you see police officers, even feeling safe. Something that Adichie addresses throughout the book is the global picture about racism and privilege and how context matters and where one is matters. So, in her blog is specifically about experiencing America as a non-American Black versus those experiences of an American Black. And because she doesn't face the same kind of racism back in Nigeria that Black folks in America do. So it's a completely new experience for her. This comes up when Shan kind of attacks her for, she says, the only reason you can do your blog is because you're not American, because you're African. If you were American, people would just call you crazy and angry. Privilege is another thing that depends on context and changes depending on where you are. So privilege is experienced differently in different countries. For example, Obinze had some class privilege at home in Nigeria, but as soon as he got to the UK, he doesn't have any privileges. He's unable to find work. It's hard for him. He can't get citizenship, or it's hard for him to even get a green card. And he's just facing challenge after challenge due to his skin color and his immigrant status until he's finally deported. This section in the book I found pretty authentic. I didn't find much that I thought seemed inauthentic. To name a few things, I found Ifamelu's conflicting feelings about Shan. They sounded really authentic to me. The feeling of meeting somebody and you're not sure how to feel about them. She's not sure. She feels like she's pretentious, but she also wants to impress her. And that makes sense to me because it's her partner's sister. She wants to, have a good relationship. And also the discomfort that Ifemelu feels around Blaine's circle of friends. When you feel like an outsider being in a group of people who have a lot in common that you might not share with them, it can be really uncomfortable. And also Ifemelu's discomfort with Mr. White and his sexual remarks and lingering gaze and the pressure with which he shook her hand. That's something really real that women have to deal with on a daily basis. So I could relate to that. Something that seemed inauthentic to me was Blaine giving Ifemelu the silent treatment. He was upset with her and he just didn't talk to her for 2 days while they were still cohabitating. So that was hard for me to imagine, living with somebody and not speaking at all. And also the way that he seemed to approach arguments with Ifemelu. He seemed really dismissive of her ideas, always calling her thoughts and processes lazy. It didn't seem like the way you would treat somebody that you care about. And it also didn't seem like the person that Blaine was when we first met him, but you never know. People are not what they seem. So how is this relevant and how should social workers understand this? Why is it important? This is super relevant and important. As social workers, we're going to have clients from all different backgrounds. So we're going to have to educate ourselves on how they're affected by systems of racism and privilege, which they will be. And I would like to put emphasis on the self-education aspect of that because the onus should not be placed on the oppressed or on our clients to teach us. Of course, we should listen to their experiences, their individual experiences, but we should have the basic knowledge of the way systems affect them. And I also think it's important to educate our peers and our colleagues if they seem to have a lapse in knowledge in the area. And just to be self-aware, you should be able to acknowledge if you have privilege. What can social workers do to challenge racism and white privilege? That's a hard question to answer. Obviously, it's hard to dismantle a whole system, but I think it's just something good for all of us to be thinking about. The feelings that I had in this section of the book, they weren't really any positive feelings. I felt sad and angry about Mr. White. Both the part that I mentioned earlier of the way he sexualized Ifemelu and how he was racially profiled and assumed to be committing a crime when having an innocent interaction with his friend. They both seemed realistic and just like everyday upsetting news that we hear. I felt empathy for Ifemelu. There was a lot going on in her head in this section. Her feelings towards Blaine and his friends. She didn't quite feel like she fit in, and I can relate to feeling lonely even in a group of people. And I felt frustrated with Shan because I thought she could have been kinder to Ifemelu. Um, it seemed like the way she treated Ifemelu was a personality trait of hers, like that's how she is, but it seemed like she could have made an effort to be more welcoming to her brother's girlfriend. And here are my references. Thank you.